Bob Semper is a physicist and science educator and the executive associate director of the Exploratorium, a very special science museum in San Francisco. He's responsible for leading the institution's work in developing programs of teaching and learning using exhibits, media, and the internet. He's also the head of the Exploratorium Center for Learning and Teaching, which contains the institution's programs in teacher professional development, youth programming, publishing, media, and internet development. Dr. Semper is the principal investigator on numerous science education, media, and research projects, including leading the National Science Foundation-sponsored Center for Informal Learning in Schools, a research collaboration between the Exploratorium, UC Santa Cruz, and King's College London. They study the relationship between museums and formal education. The Exploratorium, I'll just say as part of my introduction, is famous in the physics world as the museum that physicists, as professional scientists, love the most. Because all of us can go to this museum, find one exhibit, and spend the entire day examining it. We may do it in a different way from the typical member of the public, but it certainly is a very favorite museum among scientists. That's not true for all science museums, and I suppose that will come out a bit in our discussion tonight. To get things started, we thought maybe we would speak a bit first about general issues of museums. The origin of museums is connected to the idea of a collection of objects, really, and the first museums were things like cabinets of curiosities that gathered together things that people might want to see and may never have otherwise seen. Science is many things, a body of knowledge and an approach to learning and a theoretical framework for understanding the world, but it's not a collection of objects. And so in this way, science museums can take on many different forms. The early ones stored stuff, and there still are many museums that do this, like natural history museums, like the British Museum, or our own exhibit museum, and the museums on campus here. Many modern science museums set this aside completely and concentrate on presenting collected knowledge. And so what I wanted to ask about is how you feel about these different kinds of museums. Are these separate kinds of things, these collection-oriented museums and these experience-oriented museums, or does it make sense to combine these kinds of missions?
Yeah, so the world of museums, in my opinion, is actually pretty broad. And maybe one way to think about them is to think about the different types, a little bit of the taxonomy, at least as I view them, and to see how these museums of ideas fits into the more traditional sense of a museum of collections. See, one way to think of the history probably is around 1700s. There are really museums, the history of science museums, and the Ashmolean and Oxford is probably the best example of that kind of museum, but also the Science Museum in Florence, which I hope some of you can get to see, is a wonderful example of the history of science museums. And typically that's sort of where they started. But then there was interesting developments that happened after that. Beginning around the 1800s, you had museums which were sort of called technical museums and turned out to be actually educational museums of the first sort. They were places that had the models, the objects of the Industrial Revolution were actually places for people to learn, in a sense, what was going on in the Industrial Revolution, what kinds of how things worked. And these museums, the best example, Arts and Métiers in Paris, but also the Science Museum in London actually started as a museum like that, as actually did the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. And sort of the next generation was around 1900s, the museums of science and industry, which really were, in a sense, the full-bore presentation of the fruits, if you want, of the Industrial Revolution, the objects, the locomotives, the museums really that showed what was happening in industry. And the granddaddy of those, of course, the Deutsches Museum in Munich, but also museums that were consciously copied from that, including the one in Chicago, Museum of Science and Industry. So these are all museums that had objects, either historical objects or models or the objects of industry. And interestingly enough, the science and industry museums began to actually add interactive exhibits to help explain these objects of industry, but they were still object-based museums. But sort of in the sort of 60s, a new kind of museum began to develop, kind of a marriage, if you want, of World's Fair kinds of sites of education and some of these past museums. They were really museums about ideas, about phenomena, about experiences. And this is sort of the advent of the Science Center movement, Science Museum movement, which really began in the late 60s and sort of has led to a whole new set of museums, most of which do not have objects, do not have collections, or if they do, they may have one or two, but they really are not a museum paradigm where you think of a collection of objects. So now the question is, are these museums in the classic sense? And in fact, there was an interesting debate in the American Association of Museums in the early 70s as to whether a museum like the Exploratorium, like others at the time, could join the American Association of Museums without having a collection. And AAM said no. As a result, these museums formed their own association, right? Counter-association, Association of Science Technology Centers, and AAM said yes after a few years, but because there was a realization that actually museums of ideas, the collection of ideas, just like the collection of objects, are really all about collection of culture. And I would say at the bottom line, museums are really about culture and about providing places for people to experience and understand and see aspects of culture. And they become, therefore, not so much object-based as bases for people to see and experience culture.
Right. In some ways, this is just the continuation of a process of moving away from a completely unlabeled experiential cabinet of curiosities, where there was nothing but a bunch of objects that were intrinsically interesting, through a period where museums would begin to at least label the objects, where they would say what it was and give you some sense of its nature and origin. And I know that there's a kind of striking experience that often happens to people who go to the British Museum and read the labels and discover that the label is mostly about which person found this and where and brought it back to Britain. Not about the object or what its nature is, but about its how it got here. So they went through a period of labeling like that, and it may be that these kind of ideas museums are just the extreme version of that, where the object itself is lost, and talking about the ideas or the important features of them is all that's left of such museums. What do you think about the right place to place this kind of interpretive material? Is it the job of a museum to tell you what to think about things?
Yeah, so the whole idea of what a museum's role is as a collector and a presenter of objects is really fascinating, because they clearly are making choices. Curators make choices about what they show. Therefore, there's an authority implied in museums. And this is a constant, interesting dynamic in the museum culture of trying to understand what this authority means, understand if it's a correct authority, how to invite other people in to comment on the authority of a museum. There's been some wonderful examples of relabeling museums by collections by others to actually confront this exact question of authoritation and what's in a collection and what's out. And by just putting something on a wall or just having something in a collection, does that mean it's important, it's valued higher or not? I think my particular take about this is that the important thing about museums is not only the stuff that's in them, but the people that come in to see the stuff. And you have to always realize that it's a dialogue between the object and the person. And what's going on in the person's head and their interpretation of what they're seeing is as important as the object and what people have said it is. And given the fact that it's therefore a dialogue, you cannot, I think, in the museum field, expect to understand exactly what's going to happen for visitors that come into your place. You can provide an opportunity for experience, you can provide a point of view, but you cannot expect that you're providing the point of view, and that's what's going to be what happens for your visitors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the Exploratorium in particular now. This Exploratorium is one of the few grandparents of these modern science museums, and it has an unusual history, as each of those grandparents does. Could you say a little bit about the history of the Exploratorium?
Sure. The Exploratorium was started by a physicist, Frank Oppenheimer, a brother of J. Robert Oppenheimer. Frank was a cosmic ray scientist, experimentalist, who did research in cosmic rays and wound up working actually during the war on the Manhattan Project, working actually on the work that was happening at Oak Ridge, and finally his brother brought him in to manage the test site facility for the testing of the atomic bomb. So he was a product of that whole war effort, and unlike his brother as a theoretician, he was an experimentalist. After the war, of course, he got caught up in the politics of the time, was actually removed from the faculty position at the University of Minnesota as part of that whole process, and actually went into exile, became a rancher, cattle rancher in Colorado, but not only just in Colorado, he did it at 9,000 feet at Pagosa Springs. He was the first person to bring cattle in and try to ranch them at that altitude. And I remember visiting his ranch later on and talking to a neighbor, and the neighbor said, I said, well, it's remarkable he was able to bring cattle and figure out how to do it. And she said, well, you can do a lot if you have a lot of money and can replace your herd and can figure out how to do it. So Frank was an experimentalist, including a farmer experimentalist.
That's where the cosmic rays are.
Well,
the mountains,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're up high, right? So he, the interesting story is that after a while, the high school in Pagosa Springs needed a teacher, science. They lost their teachers in science, so they asked him if he could teach, and so he said sure, and he went and walked past the FBI, who were still at a house down by his, watching him every day, and went to teach, and began to teach by finding things in the junkyard because they had no equipment, and began to find objects and started to teach science with what he could find. And lo and behold, something interesting happened in Colorado, that the science fair winners all of a sudden started coming out of this little town in Pagosa Springs, which is a town, a very, very small town. And essentially got rediscovered and rehabilitated, and the University of Colorado actually hired him back into the faculty, both to do research, and he became then interested in the whole issue of education and how to actually create education that was personal and involved a learner-centered, and built a lab, actually, a freshman physics lab in Colorado that was in the attic of the building, where students had the interesting experience of taking any experiment at any time that they wanted to take. There was no sequence of experiments. You had to choose, you had to do all of them in the year, but you could choose which one you do, which sort of led him on a track of really thinking about, well, how could you provide effectively learner-centered learning in science? Now, at that time, he was also interested in working on curriculum, as many physicists and scientists were at the time, and they all got involved in developing new curriculum, elementary school curriculum, middle school, high school curriculum, and he was on one of the committees to do elementary school science curriculum. It's called Elementary Science Study. I'm working with Zacharias and others at MIT, and got very involved in education and realized that it would be interesting to see whether museums, as places which he loved growing up in New York as a kid, could actually be places of education in science that would actually allow people, the public, to do things that they were trying to actually have elementary school students do in the curriculum. And so he set about finding a place to do this, and through a lot of friends in the physics community in the Bay Area, came out to California and was able to start the Exploratorium in this marvelous building, the Palace of Fine Arts. One thing to say about this is, I think this year, 1968, he started this in 69, 1968-69 was an amazing period of time, because in 1 year, 3 seminal institutions were founded. The Exploratorium was one, the Lawrence Hall of Science on the campus of Berkeley as a memorial to Ernest Lawrence, and really sponsored by the Chemistry Society, was another non-object-based, idea-based museum. And the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto started the same year, which was also a non-object-based, idea-based science museum. All 3 started within a matter of a year. And I think the reason is that not only did you have this change in science education, but you also had this tremendous personalization of education going on in the 60s, where people deinstitutionalized education. Education became individually based, not institutionally based. And so the time was ripe for these kinds of places to start.
The Exploratorium is designed to spark people's curiosity, and its intent is to reach people of all different levels of scientific preparation. Now, I know as a professional scientist that it works very well for us, and I've seen it work for other kinds of people. So how do you approach doing that? How do you approach reaching a broad range of people?
Yeah, that's one of the things I think has been really interesting about the Exploratorium, is realizing that the same exhibit can work for people with all different backgrounds, knowledge, and understanding and ages. And I think it works for a variety of reasons. First, the exhibits are very much about, many of them about natural phenomena, nature. They kind of parse away some of the harder things to look at in nature, make it a little cleaner, but let people approach it so that while it's a museum of ideas, it's really about ideas about nature. So the experience is very much about the physical world and about phenomenon. Secondly, the exhibits are really authentically about nature. They have real phenomena, probably the best we can try to do, the best prisms, the best light, So they are very, I would say, emotionally interesting as well as mentally interesting. They're kind of striking, they're colorful, they really reach out, and that tends to reach across a wide variety of people. Things that are very beautiful to look at are also very complicated to talk about from a physics point of view. So we have, you're right, physicists talking about the flow and people marveling at it who've had no background in physics, and they're having a really deep, genuine experience of the same exhibit. Mm-hmm. And I guess finally I would say that the topics are chosen not necessarily to be, they're really interesting, deep topics about science. We try to do topics that are interesting to adults as well as to kids. We try to do things that are really genuinely fascinating, and we not necessarily do things that are either would be school science by itself, but try to actually do things that are on the edge about our knowledge and understanding, including a lot about visual perception or perception about the world, which is really interesting and not that well understood, so it becomes kind of fascinating for a lot of different people.
Well, let's talk about an example about how you come up with a topic, how you design it, how you decide what the appropriate goals are for this, and how you combine an object so that it actually illustrates these. Maybe you can give us one example from the Exploratorium.
So let me think of a couple good examples to do. Maybe I'll think of two of them. One of them actually came out of the elementary science study program, which is a very simple exhibit, which was really designed to show light and the many features of light. And it was a light bulb that has a nice single filament in it, and a box that goes around it that actually has within it a series of filters, slots, etc. So the light is shining out onto a table, and then there's a set of objects, a prism, a lens made all out of plastic, different kinds of filters, and it's really, in a sense, a playground of light, and mirrors that you can use to shine light around. The key is also of that exhibit to me is it's a tabletop size, so it means that 3 or 4 people can get around it. It's not just for one person, it's also not for 50 people, it's about 3 or 4. You get to manipulate things, you can do things with each other at the exhibit, point light and shine it into someone else's space, etc. So it can be socially interesting. It's got enough different things going on in it that it's just not a simple matter of looking at light shining through a lens or mirror. There's different colors that you can mix. So it's complex enough that it's got enough things to do that it doesn't run out of steam. And yet at the same time it can work for people almost to demonstrate to each other some things that they already know about science or about physics. So it has a lot of features that make it a rich kind of exhibit.
That's definitely something I see happen in these science museums, is that the people standing in front of it, they're trying to figure it out, and they're also trying to explain it to one another.
Right.
They're interacting with it in a way that is perhaps suppressed in a traditional art museum, because you're supposed to be very quiet, and you don't see people having vigorous discussions in front of works, but you do see that definitely in these kind of science situations. As part of the process of figuring it out, they really want to discuss it with people who are next to them.
Right.
To what extent is the visceral, physical involvement with the object important for exhibits that you do?
Well, certainly a lot of the exhibits we have are hands-on exhibits, and they involve, therefore, manipulating something. I think and it's a lot of probably good things that happen with some tactile experiences that you have. You get to feel things. But I think the real underlying feature about that is the fact that you get to ask your own questions and try to find some answers. And so there are some exhibits that you're not manipulative, but are rich enough to let yourself ask your own question. Frank was a wonderful teacher, and one of the things he used to say in response to this kind of question was reminding us that you can also get a lot out of an exhibit that's pretty static. And he talks about the Duck Decoy Museum that's in upstate New York, I think, where you saw every conceivable version of duck decoy, and you begin to think about, because of that, the variety and the similarities about ducks. Why are they the same? Why are they different? In other words, that's as interactive in some respects as an exhibit that you manipulate with your hands. The point is it lets you ask questions. It's not closed off so that the answer is prepared for you in advance. So that's the way I would answer this business about hands-on. It's not, everything doesn't have to be hands-on, but one good thing about hands-on is you get to try and experiment yourself and see, well, what if I do this? What if I change that?
So how much guidance do you provide at a station like this optics station?
Typically we've provided graphics that say, here's some things to do, here's some things to notice, and here's so what. And we go back and forth between how much we should write and how much we shouldn't. Sometimes we've written a lot, sometimes we've written a little. The graphics have gone through an evolutionary change back and forth depending on who was in charge of the exhibit floor. And it turns out that some people read them, some people don't. Some people figure out what to experiment with and teach someone else. A lot of people watch the people in front of them play and then they learn how to play. It's a pretty complex world. And we've done some recent experiments to understand what would keep people engaged longer at an exhibit to move to the next step. And it's, again, it kind of is variable with people, but you begin to realize that it's not so much the text, it's the way that the exhibit is designed that really propels people to try something new. If it's kind of boring what they're doing, they're not going to do anything.
A lot of it has to do with how well they can see what's happening.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that in demonstrations or in exhibits where the phenomenon is really visible and really beautiful, if possible, those are ones where people cannot resist interacting with it and exploring it in various ways. When you were talking about watching someone do it, I was thinking about the issue of having docents on the floor, experts around who can help people to work their way through something. This is something of a mixed bag, having experts on the floor, because many visitors will turn to them and ask, what is this about, and want to be told rather than getting this experience. And the thought crossed my mind that why should docents wear a pin that say they're a docent? Maybe you should just send people out there to pretend they're part of the audience.
Interlopers or shills, right?
Well, you know, might be very effective. The Exploratorium displays a set of apparatus that show people physical phenomena, that present physical phenomena that might otherwise be difficult to see or happen too fast or something of that nature. In that sense, you might think of the Exploratorium as a kind of zoo. What we do in a zoo is we go to see the animals that exist in the world presented because we can't normally see them. Do you think that's a reasonable analogy for what you do there?
Yeah, I think it actually is a good analogy. The thing about zoos there's a lot to be said about them, pro and con, and probably more a lot con these days. But the one thing, particularly before television, was it was the only place you could actually see animals up front. And I've had the experience of traveling through India and going to, wow, we're going to go see the tigers, and seeing absolutely nothing, of course, driving around for hours through this thing, because the habitats are pretty spread out. So the concentration turns out to be valuable. So similarly, I think, you know, you can learn everything about the physics of the world or nature of the phenomenon by going out in nature and studying it. But it's actually not so easy. It's got a lot of stuff around. So the idea of parsing some things away and making it simpler to do that investigation, I think, is the notion of the exhibits that we would have. So in a way, you could think of it perhaps as a zoo of phenomena and ideas, and that's maybe a good analogy.
Right, and there's a little battle that always takes place in the Science Museum between having pedagogically oriented topical subjects where you have several displays about something, and just throwing a bunch of exhibits out there all about different kinds of phenomena, letting people explore.
Right. And
I think a good fraction of the Exploratorium is spent on just a bunch of exhibits that are out there, and there are also some thematic materials now too, I guess.
Yeah, there is actually there was and is a thematic approach to what's happening in the museum. By that I mean there was notion very consciously to attack an idea, light or color, and to actually have refraction, reflection, diffraction, all of those things. But because the exhibits were all sort of standalone things tabletop, it doesn't quite seem like it's this kind of integrated, seamless curriculum. And you can kind of go in any direction.
There isn't a careful walk-through path, yes, right.
And that's the difference. So, an interesting story about that is our exhibits are pretty jumbled in the Exploratorium, and we built a show that went to Paris, La Valette, the large science museum there. And we shipped the show over, light and color. And we got to Paris, and they were all set up by the designer who put them there, and we got there, and they're all in neat rows, all curricularly. It was like a book. You went down the main aisle, and you could go right to refraction and left to diffraction. And so it was interesting. We used to call it the Cartesian room. And so that night, we actually moved the exhibits all around and made them more interesting to go through, a little bit more of a flow. And the next day, I had this interesting experience about realizing that this, of course, and part of it was his pedagogical thinking was actually from schooling, and he did it from a school perspective, actually, interesting enough. But the next day I got up and realized that Paris, of course, as a city, is completely designed in an associative fashion, right? It's designed with circles and squares and radiated neighborhoods. And in a sense, it as a city is designed like the Exploratorium as a museum. And then I came back to San Francisco, and of course we have the crazy thing of a grid pattern in a city that has hills, which means of course you go up and down. So it's kind of an interesting thing to think about how the spatial design affects the educational experience. And I think we don't know enough about that. It'd be interesting to study that more.
Education has been a part of museums from the start. That was one of their initial goals, to show people things that they would not otherwise see, whether that was animals or art or curiosities. And they provide a way to collectively share things that are rare or impossible for everyone to possess. So does it make sense to think of the exhibits in modern science museums as a kind of expensive and complex and shared resource, something that's, especially an educational resource, something that's just not possible to have in every school?
Yes, I think it could. It's interesting to think about why we teach science in school and what the point is of school science. And one of the things that we've spent a lot of time trying to do is help people teach inquiry-based methods in school, which we think is important for science, being able to ask your own questions, your own discovery. It turns out that's not so easy to do in schools. I mean, it's hard for teachers who have not maybe had deep science experience to do that. Also, the environment is not necessarily an environment of inquiry and discovery. It's designed really for other things, skill-based learning, et cetera. So if you think of museums, which are ideal places for this kind of piece of the education, it would be interesting to try to think of a system of schooling that involves also museums as an integral part of what they do, and therefore it would be an environment for people to experience things that may not be so easy to have in school. At the lower grades, it's just inquiry experience. At the upper grades, you can have apparatus and equipment in a museum setting and maintained that you could not effectively do in a lot of schools necessarily. So I think if we had a more coherent system, we'd actually be better off in terms of science education.
Right, this is a way, one step which exists now for breaking out of the system of sitting in the classroom to try and learn science. And it might well be that it would be well served by many other forms of breaking out, being in the outdoors, in nature, traveling to places that have other kinds of experiences like planetariums. So there are other examples, I think, that fit into this same mold of an extra resource that can only be supported in a shared way. One of the ways of structuring the interaction between museum materials and an audience is the kind of guided tour or something more like a lecture. What do you think about the effectiveness of that kind of approach? Are there ever guided tours at the Exploratorium?
Yes, actually there are. The place is designed, of course, to just come and visit on your own. But some of the most interesting things are when you go around with a staff person who takes you on a tour. And it turns out there's probably many different ways to go through a tour of the museum. What's interesting about it is it's personal to the person leading the tour. And so I think guided tours have a wonderful place. I'm not necessarily one of these anti-docent people. The difficulty is that I think you also want to have an experience of free running. So our field trips, for example, have a period of guidance and a period of not guidance, very consciously. We don't want to just make the whole thing a kind of a led session. So I think there's really a place for both, and we've often talked about how it would be interesting to have a tour through the museum by a scientist or by a cook or by an artist or by a painter or a mechanic or something, because the stories you'd hear around the same exhibits would be quite different.
So you could have different sorts of interpreters,
right,
and not imagine. This gets back to the idea you raised in the beginning that the experience of the museum for different people is utterly different because they bring with them different backgrounds. Right. That idea of tours from a variety of people would be fascinating to watch. That's certainly true. Going to the museum is really fun for most students as well. I know that most children crave the day when they get the field trip to a museum. But then they go back to the classroom. And in what ways does the Exploratorium try to leverage that brief museum experience in the classroom, work on curriculum and things like that? So
you in the museum community know this. The big problem about visiting the museum and field trips is that the field trips all happen in May, April, May, June. Our biggest day is June 10th, right? And yet, if you really believe that museums can be places to spark curiosity, develop motivation, they should be happening in September, October, November, right? So this is a problem that no one's been able to solve. We certainly haven't been able to solve it. We have, though, and other museums have really worked on how to extend the episodic visit into a learning experience that can be carried into other worlds. And we, among other places, have been doing experiments with electronic means to do that, with wireless handheld devices, with RFID systems. Certainly, museums traditionally have been producing catalogs and other things that allow you to take the thing with you away to use it somewhere else. I think if we can do more about that, we have the ability to actually help support this educational process in a larger way. You don't want to detract from the power of a museum visit, which is local, physical, exciting, as you said, episodic. So you have to do this carefully. But I still think it's something that it's kind of like if we can do that better, I think we would all be better off as a field.
Yeah, technology like perhaps small computers, which enable you to have a very rich, layered kind of set of information about what you're doing, might be the way to provide a very broad range of different experiences for people in front of something, as opposed to having signs which, if they're going to say a little, can be small, but if they're going to say a lot, have to be enormous. And if you can bury that kind of depth in an electronic medium, that's a very nice way to approach it. Now, before we finish up, I want to ask a little bit about presenting not just scientific knowledge, the facts that we've learned and the theories that we use to organize them, but also the public image of the scientific endeavor and the community of scientists. I know that science museums are trying to help explain or increase public understanding of science as a process, and of scientists even. And to what extent do you think they're able to do that?
Yeah, I think that the notion of what science is and what scientists do is one that really we need to spend more time on in terms of our educational process. And we spend a lot of time on what's the facts of science, but very little on the process of science. Science centers have been actually trying to talk about the process as well. I think it's possible, particularly if you associate with science centers, with their exhibits, their objects, start to really use the world of media, you can actually present the activity of doing science either in a science center or through a science center. I actually think the issue of the relationship between science and the public, the relationship of these two, science talking to the public learning about science, could really be helped by sort of having a mediating agent or a transformative agent between these two worlds. And there I think the world of science centers can really play an important role. Science centers are really good at content, design, and pedagogy, ways of teaching, and they have people who are really good at translators between these two worlds. So my belief, they can actually play a more active role than they do now and actually work as a medium of translation between the world of doing science and the world of the public learning about what science is all about. The notion of what science is very, very difficult. It's very sort of unknown by the general public because their experience with science is actually about school science. They have experience about doing labs in high school. That's what they think scientists do. Right. That's not why I went into science. I'm sure that's not why you went into science. That's not what we do every day. We need to show this as a human activity, and yet it's not easy to do because scientists are busy. They work in places that are fairly private. So can we actually figure out new mechanisms to do that? And I think museums can help. And
what I would say is the closest thing to an experience of what science really is what you can see happen among the best exhibits at a place like the Exploratorium, where students and their parents and elderly people encounter some phenomenon, stand there and try and figure it out. And that process that they're going through is closer to real science than they probably imagine that it is. Now, earlier today you used an analogy. You described this kind of connection that a science museum can make between the science community and the public as a transformer, something that would lie in an electrical circuit between the power plant and your house. And one part of a transformer that an electrical engineer or physicist would know about is that the perfectly tuned transformer would become invisible to either side. Is that a goal, you think?
Yeah, I would say that is a good goal. The thing about transformers that are great is that each side affects the other side if you want to get a good matching, right? The whole point is to match the impedance. So the particular issue for me about science and the public is that typically in the world of science, we tend to think of pushing the world of science into the public. And yet we know that from a museum community, it's a pull business, that the public has to want to learn something or that's not going to happen. So you need devices or need enterprises to do that. To me, the smooth interpretation that a science center can do will, in fact, make it invisible in some sense between the contact of the public and science. So at least I think that would be a good goal.
So you hope to make the Exploratorium
invisible.
Invisible.
That's right.
All right. Well, on that note, I think we'll
this
stop.
This isn't being taped, is it?
And take some questions.
If you see a difference in the way visitors respond to exhibits or experiences that deal with truly natural phenomena as opposed to technological phenomena, is there a difference there or not?
Is there a difference? Well, on the one hand, there's something that we used to call the fish factor, which is that if you had fish in your exhibit, you had a factor of 2 or 3 times the attendance than if you did in your museum. So clearly, there's a natural interest to go to natural history museums, to zoos, aquaria. They're very popular, and they have a popularity, I would say, that's larger than perhaps science centers. By the same token, I think I've seen awe and wonder happen in any kind of exhibit: life science, physical science, perception, astrophysics. So in some sense, I'm not sure how I would answer if there's a difference. I think sort of there's an access. It's maybe easier access sometimes to warm and furry animals or something. But I've seen amazing experiences of people spend hours trying to understand issues in cosmology, relativity, things that you might say are really not the same as the life science world. So I don't know how I would really respond to that.
Yeah, one of the answers I would give, and hope that people would learn in a museum like the Exploratorium, is that even technological things are actually natural phenomena. They all obey the laws of physics, and they all are actually part of the same thing. Although a transistor may look like it's got magic in it, it doesn't. It has physics in it, and those same physical laws are governing everything.
True, the physical laws may be exactly the same and respond in the same way, but on one hand, what you're talking about or looking at are things that go on without human intervention, as opposed to technological issues which have to do with everything to do with human intention. And so you're right, actors know enough never to play a scene with a dog or a child. But do you play with the bridge or the skyscraper in a different way? And we know that in K-12 education, there is a very clear delineation. There are separate sets of national standards for technological literacy and scientific literacy. So the question is, in institutions like yours or any other kind of a science center, science museum, do you treat those two things as differently as they are treated in the K-12 system? I guess that's another way of phrasing it.
That's a different question. Yeah, okay, so at the Exploratorium, we don't do very much with technology. We've consciously been focused on questions of science and inquiry. And there are many museums that do things with technology. The one thing I would say about technology is I always view technology as also a human enterprise. And to me, my favorite technology museum is Williamsburg, because it's a place that actually situates technology within a social construct. And to some extent, there are other places. I mean, Deerfield Village has similar things too. The point is about technology is it by itself is always around the human enterprise. I mean, that's part of its definition. And that actually means you need to add those components if you're really going to tell the story of technology. It's not just the device, it's the use of the device. It's not just the flash memory, it's the fact that iPod's a phenomenon. That's the thing about technology that I think you have to try to tell. And that's not always so easy unless you add the context for the technological experience.
And just to get back to this point about natural phenomena, there are many things that come about from human intervention, but they can only happen if they happen naturally. So when you light a fire in your fireplace, there's a human act that causes it to happen. But it takes place because it is lowering the overall entropy in your fireplace. It's a natural act that's taking place in there, even though you started it. And there isn't anything in technology that isn't of that nature.
But what I noticed time and time again was that where my sense of what you folks are doing is sort of free form, and the person will discover on their own, following their own path to get there. What I noticed consistently at La Villette was that there was only one proper path, and the student, the observer, was supposed to follow that path. It was an invisible path, but it was very clear that that's what the path was. And time again, I'd look at these exhibits and get the message that this stuff is really, really patronizing. If I were an 8-year-old kid, I would be insulted. And, you know, as a 40-year-old at the time, I was insulted then. And I guess to me the big question then becomes, what would you characterize as sort of the core art of putting these interactive things together? If you overscript them, you end up with the patronizing result that I saw so many times in La Villette. If you underscript them, it's just kind of the person goes up and says, well, okay, what do I do? There must be something in between, and is there any sort of metric or algorithm you use to understand how to pitch it?
Yeah, so I would agree that it's a delicate balance. And of course, since you're dealing with a visitor who's all different, you probably are not getting the balance right for every person, but you try to strike a middle ground. I think the key is getting, maybe, I would argue it this way, that you have to get the granularity right. By that I mean, we may have an exhibit on light, but we haven't put all the things into a giant wall of light or something like that. So there's an opportunity for individual flexibility. That means we have to be willing for people to miss something. In fact, they can miss quite a lot, and it's okay. That an experience at a particular exhibit by itself is profound enough. One of the comments I hear about the Exploratorium that I find very fascinating is people continually tell me that they discovered something on their own in that space. They found an exhibit around a corner or down the hall. In other words, it violates one of the precepts of actually design, which might be to make everything visible clearly and cleanly. People like the fact that they found something they thought maybe we forgot. It was around the corner, and we probably did forget it, you know. But somehow that was empowering to their experience, and it really takes visitor-centered education to the ultimate max. Now, we can get away with it. We're not a school, you know. I don't mean to say that all learning can happen this way. We are not a school. We have great freedom to do it. But if you really believe in visitor learning, you have to accept the fact that they may not learn anything. And that's okay too. So I think the granularity is key, though. There is a structure involved. It's not stuff willy-nilly. There was intentionality in the thought about the stuff that was designed and developed. But it was put there in a way that allows people to make their own meal of it in a way. That's what we try to do. We don't always succeed. It's a lot of testing and evaluation, everything from the individual exhibit with the individual exhibit builder looking at it to large-scale evaluation and research. The interesting question is, what are you asking people? In my opinion, what do you ask people what should be happening there? I mean, do you ask them a question at the end? Did you learn about this? I'm not sure that that's the experience they've had when they've played with a tornado or played with something. So the tricky part is I don't really know how to ask the right question. I don't even know the methodology that would get at what I think is the learning that's happening. There's people in this room probably even know more about this, but there's different things that people have tried to do that. But it's non-trivial to ask people stuff when you can't really ask them some kind of verbal knowledge that presumably came out of an exhibit, because I didn't design the exhibit for them to get that in the first place.
Yeah, and in our formal courses here at the university, we give lots of tests. We are able to assign grades to students, but I think very few instructors have the sense that at the end of the class they really understand what their students know, even though we give all these tests, right? You know how they answered the questions on the test, that's fine, but that's very different from having a deep sense of what they've really learned and how richly it's been learned.
Do you design your exhibits to take into account people's misconceptions about whatever the phenomena it is that you're looking at? And do you study that in the process?
Yeah, we actually don't take into account directly misconceptions. I mean, you know, we haven't found it productive to actually try to change people's misconceptions directly in exhibits. It'd be interesting to know whether one could or not do that experimentally. I know there's a whole field of work about misconceptions in science, and then there's a big question about whether it's important to know that there's misconceptions or just go ahead and do everything anyway, but realize that they're, you know, I mean, it's not clear what you do pedagogically to me with misconceptions with that whole set of research. In the exhibit world is pretty strange. There's a great story I heard of an exhibit that was built in Franklin Institute, which was an exhibit of the Earth And it was designed to say, let me see if I can get this right, that, that magnetism in the Earth had nothing to do with us sticking on the Earth. It was all about gravity. Right? And there's a big sign that says magnetism is not why you stick on the Earth. And they did a study of people leaving, and most people left thought magnetism had something to do with sticking on the Earth because it was mentioned in the graphics. So, you know,
they probably had never thought of that before, and now they know why they stick on the Earth.
I think you could, you know, I suppose you could tackle this by having a set of exhibits that really tried to show some fundamental features that are often misunderstood, and maybe work with that. We have not gone that route. We have just basically showed phenomenon and presented things as they are. We haven't consciously done that. I don't know if anyone has tried that. I know there's been people who've done that pedagogically with exhibits, and a lot of classroom stuff that's been done. And it would be interesting to, that's a great research project to actually see if that actually was valuable or not valuable to do. It's an interesting idea.
Getting back to the technology versus nature and just representing it argument, I would like to say, just coming from a social construction of science and technology perspective, that nature is just as intimately tied to construction as technology is, and so I think, as we were talking about bringing the process of science into the public, I think that's where humans are very much intertwined. And my question concerns the responsibility for science centers in creating a forum for conversation between the public and scientists and professionals in the applications of science and their consequences for society as a whole.
Yeah, I think science centers are unique places to actually sponsor dialogue in the public about science, and I think they're great examples of places that have done this. Science cafes are sprouting up at science centers in Europe, and there's starting to be a movement here in the United States. And I think it's a great place to provide opportunities for discussion and dialogue.
Could you describe the science cafes a little?
Yeah, so science cafes in Europe were actually places where they were science, in UK they started with science talks, where you went to a local bar and there was a topic and someone presented the topic for about one beer's length, and then people went back and got another beer and they discussed it. And it's now extended to physical places. The Science Museum of London has actually a built-in one in the building behind them, the Dana Center. Other places are starting to build them. They're places of conversation about science, either about science topics, sometimes they're dialogues and even debates about science, which particularly in Europe, where the issue about science is one about citizen engagement with science and the roles and purposes and directions of science, more than it is in this country. I think science centers can be great places for that. I think we've taken the approach at the Exploratorium that we are not really in a position to be talking or telling or working with people about what should or shouldn't happen. We're giving a venue of ideas and experiments for people to learn what's going on. So we did a great thing when Chernobyl happened. We had a public forum about that, where people could just ask questions about what's going on over there. What does it mean? What does this data mean? That to me was a really great opportunity and role. So I view them as sort of public places of discourse. Perhaps as universities could in fact be, or are in fact as well. In a way, they're kind of like neutral science bodies in a town, or thought of that way by the public.
Yeah, I think they probably have a different perception. The university is still a little more removed from the public than that, because they're used to, this is a place where you go with your children. It's a very comfortable place. Mm-hmm. That might give them that special role.
What has been your impact on science and scientists, given your position between science and the public? You clearly affect the public, but how have you affected science?
I could answer it a couple ways. One is we've been working on developing programs to actually work with science graduate students, science postdocs, to actually help them understand issues about learning and about public understanding of science and the tools and the techniques that help that communication happen. So we're actually in a process of trying to develop, in a sense, professional development for scientists. I also know, as you mentioned, particularly the Exploratorium has a nice, because of its founding direction, and we've been able to maintain that, a relationship with the scientific community that's very solid, I would say. And we're trying to use that platform actually to get the right debate between the world of science centers and the world of science, because it's my belief that if we could get the world of science centers in a more organized fashion to then be talking with the world of science in an organized fashion, we could actually have a larger, a more, I won't say more efficient, but a more productive program of public engagement with science. And so we're kind of working both sides of those camps. We're also working very hard to make museums be part of the discussion about science education, and it's meant a lot of, because people think of science education, you think of schools. It's like, we're trying to make the case, and have been successful to some degree, to get that enlarged so that science centers in general are at the table when we talk about science education. I think that's how I would answer it. I would say, by the way, that there's a big need to have more scientists involved in science centers, that we need more people from the world of science. And to do that, we think we have to get more scientists to know about this world, so we have to engage the scientific community.
I wanted to know how you take your message off your site. How do you manifest yourself in the community beyond your wall?
We have taken two tracks for that, working beyond the walls. One is we decided at the Exploratorium very early on to concentrate a lot of our endeavors on teacher development, with the notion that the teachers are working with students, not necessarily the ones who come to visit us, and we have a bigger impact if we could affect their ability to be teaching. So that's one side of it. The other is through the use of media. We've really tried to extend our world both through publishing and traditional media, like some work in television and radio, but more recently through our work on the online community, to really dissolve the walls of the institution and to say, we are actually a producer of science media for the interactive world, for people way beyond San Francisco. And that has turned out to be pretty interesting, at least in our case, a pretty effective way to reach a lot of people. And we've tried to use our museum sensibilities not to be a different kind of media producer, but to be a museum that produces media experiences for people on the outside, beyond our walls. I think museums have a great role to do that. Their place-basedness is really important. Their specificity of location is very important to what they do. But because of the advent of new media, we have the ability now to extend the kinds of activities that happen and the richness that happens in that place to a much wider audience and provide opportunities beyond the visitation.
What are some of the qualitative differences between exhibiting what we might call finished science and unfinished science, current things going on?
So a lot of science centers present what I would say is school science. And I used to say, school science is like regular science, like airplane food is to regular food. School science is highly processed, great for what it does, which is get you through the plane, but it's not really real science in a sense. And it's fundamental to real science, and as you point out, the experience of asking questions and discoveries about doing it. But so the real question is sort of, can we do things about current science and current science discovery? And I think museums can play a role in that. I would say that a lot of that, though, is going to take more than traditional exhibitory techniques. It takes involvement with different forms of media. It involves bringing in the doing of science, the unknown questions, into other formats, into museum settings to make it clear. I mean, it's like any other cutting-edge human enterprise. It's kind of messy. It's kind of opinionated. There's no clear way necessarily to talk about it. A lot of stuff is pretty complex. So you have to use different media, different tools to present, I think, this to a public. But I do think it's the role of science centers to do that because they are good places for people to feel like they can ask questions and they can interact with a scientific literate staff and folks who come in from the outside to talk about that sort of thing.
It's very challenging to get people who are comfortable to bring people to the frontier. I often find that when our graduate students, for example, talk to someone about a subject which is not fully known, like perhaps the current state of cosmology, they're reluctant to tell the people they talk to that we don't know about something. And so it requires a great deal of confidence to stand in front of an audience in a science museum and say, we don't know about that. Or to try and express that there's some ideas and there's some evidence, but it's not clear yet. And so a very high level of confidence and expertise is required to do that. And I think that's one of the hard parts about it.
It's really true. And I'm really struck that scientists are really good at saying things with great force, that they know something, at the same time being really good at questioning themselves constantly. And it's a very interesting dilemma. The public persona is of precision, and yet the fact of the matter is it's a field that's constantly questioning itself. So it's very interesting to try to talk about that to a public. It's not easy to present that kind of experience.
And there's a very negative feedback, because a lot of people are very happy to hear you say, this is the way it is. I think if you look at the current discussions of global climate change, you'll see that there is you can earn a living by taking one view or another with great strength. And you probably won't get called back if you won't take either view.
Hi, Rob. Can you tell us a little bit more about the connection between science and art and perception that the Exploratorium?
Oh, right. We didn't talk. Good point. So one of the features of the Exploratorium that started very early on was, it was originally called the Museum of Science, Technology, and Human Perception. That was the original plan. The doors opened, and almost instantly, it turns out we had art in the building. And it sort of came partially serendipitously. The first exhibit turned out that filled space. The space was pretty empty, like 3 exhibits, and we needed to fill space. I wasn't there, so I can only talk about this historically. Frank needed to fill space. The Stanford Linear Accelerator had just had an exhibit on the art of the Stanford Linear Accelerator with beautiful pictures of the copper plating apparatus. And I mean, it was effectively a gorgeous amount of material as a byproduct of producing the accelerator. So that was available. So that came up and sort of filled some space at the Exploratorium. And then an interesting show called Cybernetic Serendipity was at the Corcoran. It was a show of kinetic art, and it was at the Corcoran and Washington, D.C., and it was just ended, and they had no place to go. And they had met Frank, the people there, and they said, well, we don't have any place to go. Would you like this exhibit? He said, sure. I was getting space filling right. So they hired a truck and brought this exhibit out, and it's full of interactive art pieces that were perceptual in nature, were really interesting, strange, some of the most interesting work. And it really resonated with the place, and realized, because our topic was perception, that the people that were working there really realized that the artist's eye view of the world was also pretty interesting, and they were actually creating dramatic pieces that were exploring the world, a certain set of artists. I mean, the people are working kind of on an exterior plane rather than so much an interior plane. And that set in motion a whole artist in residence program, which became key to developing some of our most interesting exhibits. And it was really the notion that artists are explorers about the world as well. They're trained investigators. They destabilize themselves to investigate the world, and their products, particularly when they're looking at natural world, were as interesting in a sense as some of the work that the scientists were doing. And that became a really important part of the work of the Exploratorium, integral to the work of the Exploratorium, and interestingly enough, not very carried over into other places. And I find that quite interesting, because it's so key to what we do, because it's about investigation. We're really trading on artists investigating. It's not the finished piece so much as the investigation people do to get there. And that's true, by the way, for the exhibits that the scientists are building as well. It's that period of discovery that we try to maximize and explore.
This visual connection can be a very key part of what it takes to get people to stop, too. If you can make something that is this visually engaging, the extra level of beauty that is involved in it can be more than enough to make the difference for a lot of exhibits too. And sometimes someone who works professionally on those kind of things, on graphic design and so on, can make the difference.
As we all know, there's been explosive growth in the whole industry, and the notion really has been that bigger is better. And quite often these bigger institutions are struggling and/or are failing. From your perspective, what's the next generation of the experience?
No, you're very right to say that the field's gone through a period of expansion. For a long time, audiences were building. There was a great interest. That expansion now is in a serious question, because the audiences are dropping a bit. Other things are competing, everything from the internet to other kinds of experiences. I guess I would say 2 things that are, my perspective, I would say there's 2 key things. One is, I think science centers need to get back to their educational roots. They are, and they came from an educational paradigm. I think that's why communities support them, And I think that if they would get more in tune with the educational needs of their community, they would actually have a better chance of succeeding. So that's number one. Number two, there's some interesting trends in some science centers are becoming more connected with their community in a broader way. They are actually, some of the most interesting experiments I've seen have been bringing in other partners into a science center facility to provide other kinds of services. So they actually become places of public science. They might have a library, they might have a job center, they might have other things that actually could be consolidated, places that there's more reason to come to this facility. And they're not just a place to come with your family on a weekend, they're places to come as an adult. There's more rationale for its existence. They could be connected to universities. We've been talking a bit about that this trip. How do you make those connections work as part of a science center really embedded in the community? So those are my two senses of where I would sort of paint the future picture. I think building big standalone spaces is a bit problematic if you can't support the infrastructure it takes to maintain them.
I was struck thinking about science museums, how many of them are housed in leftover buildings. Of course, the Exploratorium is, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Even the Ashmolean Museum is now a science history museum in an old building. And the Hands-On Museum, of course, is in such a space. You know, that may suit this kind of production more sensibly.
To bring you back to comment on history and growth, you named 3 museums that started about the same time, and I thought it might be interesting to compare their different approaches and how they've changed or not changed over the years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they started at the same time, I would argue, from the same fundamental reason. I'm talking about the Exploratorium, the Lawrence Hall of Science, and the Ontario Science Center. They both were object-less museums. They were both museums of experience. They had many of the same exhibits in them, quite interestingly. Yet they really had 3 different approaches. The Exploratorium really was designed to be, had a sense of itself as the public coming to have their own experience and being really an R&D institution in this field of informal learning. That's really its hallmark. Lawrence Hall of Science on the Berkeley campus really worked a lot with the curriculum development that was continuing to happen at Berkeley, and SCIS and a lot of other GEMS and FOSS. Some of the students, maybe FOSS might be in the school system here, came out of the work at that. It became an R&D lab for curriculum, and has a public side, certainly. It didn't. We stayed on the public side, the phenomenological side. They were more into the curriculum and the science process, which sort of really came out of the differences between, I would say, the MIT side of science education and the Berkeley side, which are these 2 streams. Well, you need both, they're not either or, but it's interesting where the roots came from. The Ontario Science Center is much different. It was started by a designer, Taizo Miyake, with a small team of people who were creating interesting, fun, rich experiences for individuals. That was their strategy. They didn't come out of an educational thread. But they did come out of the 60s. And to me, what's fascinating is the same exhibit appears in all 3 museums for many years. The Ontario Science Center has moved on and become it's a major government-sponsored museum. So our museum is a private nonprofit in San Francisco. Lawrence Hall of Science is an academic unit of Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. The Ontario Science Center is effectively a quasi-public-private museum in Toronto with a lot of government funding from Ontario. And what they've done is done a lot of work internationally. They spend a lot of time actually helping other museums around the world to develop and grow. It really is part of Canada's interest in internationalization. And has moved into subjects, interesting social subjects. They have exhibits on risk, they have exhibits on lots of social issues which are really at play in Canada right now. So they all kind of went their own direction. They all sustained themselves and are all kind of, I mean, they're still here after that many years, but it's interesting to see how they went. And then I've noticed a lot of museums that subsequently got built kind of sort of went to all the various places and then sort of picked and chose things that they personally thought would work in their local museum. And so you see bits and pieces of these museums. I see them all over, at least I think I see them all over in other museums in the country.
Good. Well, this has been a really rich and informative conversation, a wonderful way to kick off our series. I'd like to thank Dr. Rob Semper, Dr. Tim McKay, and all of you for coming out this evening. Thanks very much.
Thank you.